Good morning. I've been asked to speak to you for about 30 minutes this morning on the early history of Washington County, and I'm both happy and honored to do that, subject to the 3 disclaimers I always give when I'm asked to speak about something related to our local history. And that is, number 1, this talk is meant to be a broad general overview of the subject. Number 2, I do not consider myself to be an expert on the subject, and I'm certainly not a historian. I'm just a local guy who was born and raised in Washington County who has always had an interest in our local history. And third, I tend to speak quickly. But subject to those 3 disclaimers, let's talk about the early history of Washington County. In order to put the early history of Washington County in perspective, we need to talk about the early days of Wisconsin, and to do that, we need to go back to the end of the Revolutionary War. The end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 gave our young country this tremendous opportunity for western expansion into what was called the frontier, which at that point in time was anything west of the Appalachian Divide, that group of mountain ranges that runs from Maine down to Georgia and includes the White Mountains, the Green Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, etc. At the end of the Revolutionary War, most Americans were residing in the towns along the eastern seaboard or immediately inland from those cities. Very few people were residing in the frontier. But by 1790, there would be 220,000 people living in the frontier. And that western migration presented our young government with a lot of practical problems, including how do we establish a uniform system of laws that all settlers can rely on no matter where they might be. Those practical problems were complicated by a couple of things. First, our United States Constitution was still some years away from being ratified, and the Continental Congress, as it was then called, did not have the same broad powers to deal with those issues that our current Congress has. Additionally, immediately after the war, the original 13 states were out of control, grabbing land wherever they could find it and calling that land a colony of that particular state. Things got so out of control that at one point in time, what we now call Wisconsin was claimed in part by Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. To deal with those issues, the Continental Congress passed a series of ordinances, culminating in what was known as the Ordinance of 1787, or the Northwest Ordinance. And what the Northwest Ordinance did is take a big chunk of that frontier, everything west of the Appalachian Divide, east of the Mississippi River, north of the Ohio River, and south of Canada, and they called that the Northwest Territory. And the Continental Congress imposed certain rules and regulations and laws with regards to the entire Northwest Territory. And it also said, look, we anticipate there'll be at least 5 and as many as 7 new states that come into the Union from the Northwest Territory. And when they come in, they're coming as separate and equal states on par with the original 13, not parts of any existing state. And this is the way it's going to occur. When Congress thinks the time is right, Congress will carve out a piece of that Northwest Territory. They will create a separate independent territory. The President will appoint a territorial governor. The territorial governor will arrange for the election of a territorial legislature, and that will put that new territory squarely on the road to statehood, which will occur when the population of that territory reaches 60,000 people. So in 1800, Congress carves out the Ohio Territory, which in 1803 becomes the state of Ohio. And they do the same thing with the Indiana Territory in 1809 and the Illinois Territory in 1819, until what we are left with is that piece of the Northwest Territory then called the Michigan Territory. And it stays the Michigan Territory until July 3rd, 1836, when Congress carves out the western portion of the Michigan Territory and creates a separate independent territory called the Wisconsin Territory. President Andrew Jackson appoints one of his fellow Indian fighters as the territorial governor, that being Colonel Henry Dodge. Governor Dodge arranges for the election of a territorial legislature, 13 members of the legislature, 26 members of the House of Representatives, and on October 25th, 1836, the territorial legislature meets for the very first time 2 miles outside tiny Belmont, Wisconsin, 15 miles south of Mineral Point, in what we now call Lafayette County in the southwest corner of the state. The southwest corner of the state at that time being the center of the lead mining industry, and it is lead mining that is really driving the bus as far as the early territorial days go. Lead mining is so important to the history of Wisconsin that if you look at the Great Seal of the state of Wisconsin, you'll see 2 individuals there. One is a sailor and the other is a lead miner, and of course it is the image of those lead miners living in those primitive caves on the sides of the hills of southwestern Wisconsin that give rise to our state mascot, the badger. When the Territorial Legislature meets in Belmont, they obviously have a lot on their plate. They need to figure out where the state capital is going to be, and they also need to discuss establishing a series of roads. If your goal is to grow the population of the territory to 60,000 people so you can become a state, you need a series of roads to allow settlers both in the state and freedom to move around the state to establish settlements. And in 1836, territorial roads in Wisconsin are few and far between. So much so that between 1836, when Wisconsin becomes a territory, and 1848, when Wisconsin becomes a state, the Territorial Legislature authorizes the construction of 220 territorial roads. The other issue, however, that the territorial government needs to deal with is the issue of how to administer this territory. And in that regard, they decide to divide the state into a series of counties, but that county system is nothing like the 72 county system we have today. The entire population of the territory in 1836 is only about 20,000 people, and Governor Dodge first divides the entire territory into a grand total of 6 counties. But as the population grows and the legislature becomes more familiar with the territory, it begins to subdivide those major 6 counties into sub-counties. And on December 7th, 1836, a portion of Milwaukee County, by an act of the legislature, is carved out and a new independent county created called Washington County. Now, that doesn't mean as much as you might think, because it wasn't until 1840, when something called the Act of Organization is passed by the legislature, that Washington County is subject to its own administration. Before that time, it was administered out of Milwaukee County, and in fact, even after that date, certain departments are still run out of Milwaukee County. But December 7th, 1836 is a very historic day for the people of Washington County. Now, as I'm sure you are all aware, in 1836, that Washington County was supersized as compared to the existing Washington County today, in that the north and south borders of that county ran due east to the shore of Lake Michigan and included what we now call Ozaukee County. And given the population centers of that supersized county, the state legislature, the territorial legislature rather, names Port Washington, originally called Sauk Harbor, as the county seat of that supersized county, which makes sense, because just like in the early days of our country, the primary population of the supersized Washington County is along the shore of Lake Michigan or immediately inland from the shore of Lake Michigan. The western portion of the supersized Washington County being largely undeveloped. As an aside, a practical problem arises when Port Washington falls into such a state of disrepair that the territorial government moves the county seat temporarily from Port Washington to what was called Hamburg, now Grafton, although as a practical matter, the county government was run out of the home of one William Bonnywell, as in Bonnywell Road, at his house just south of Grafton on Wauwatosa Road before being moved back to Port Washington. But that dynamic concerning the population centers of Washington County would change as the territory begins to grow in population and as the territorial government begins to establish this 220 road system of territorial roads, as I mentioned earlier. The most important to us being a territorial road that the legislature authorizes to be constructed in 1845, which is meant to connect the soon-to-be incorporated city of Milwaukee, which will be in the next 20 years the second largest city in Wisconsin, that being the city of Fond du Lac. The territorial legislature authorizes 3 individuals to lay out that new road. Those 3 individuals are prominent Milwaukee businessmen, Brian Kilbourne, James Nealon, and Dr. E.B. Walcott. In the course of laying out that road, those gentlemen determined that it would be in the interests of the people using the road and the financial interests of those gentlemen themselves to establish a settlement about halfway between Milwaukee and Fond du Lac. And that's exactly what happens when they find land suitable for settlement along the bend of the Milwaukee River and purchase 720 acres of that land from the territorial government. They bring in people to lay out that new settlement, file the original plat of the city of West Bend, the village of West Bend as it was then called, in January of 1846. And it was the growth of that West Bend settlement and the communities around that West Bend settlement that leads to a nearly decade-long conflict between the residents of the western half of the supersized Washington County and the more established eastern half of that county. And it doesn't take long for that division to occur. Shortly after West Bend is established in 1845, things began to heat up as the Territorial Legislature recognized that statehood was right around the corner, which would occur again on May 31st, 1848. And in anticipation of statehood, the territorial government does two things. It passes a law which changes the makeup of the county government from a board of commissioners to a board of supervisors, with each township in any particular county entitled to representation on that board of supervisors. Secondly, it says to the individual counties in the territorial Wisconsin, you need, by popular vote, to establish a temporary county seat. And the winner of that election needs to get at least 50% of the vote. In Washington County, that election is held in April of 1846. It results in several different places receiving votes, some of them not even townships, but locations. The area receiving the greatest number of votes, 371, is a location simply called County Farm, which is a location southeast of Jackson that housed the County Poor Farm, which makes some sense because it was centrally located in the supersized Washington County. Other areas receiving votes were a good location near the center of the county and the center of the county. Among the municipalities themselves, county seat is followed by Port Washington, Cedarburg, Hamburg, i.e. Grafton, and surprisingly, the recently established West Bend receives 12 votes. Also interesting is the fact that Hartford is never in the picture, because Hartford was always convinced that the Territorial Legislature would carve out a piece of the western part of Washington County and a piece of the eastern part of Dodge County and create a new county that Hartford would be the county seat of. Of course, as we know, that never happens. But since none of the municipalities receive 50% of the vote, by default, Port Washington remains the temporary county seat. But the failure of Port Washington to outright win the election leaves a bitter taste in the mouths of the entire eastern portion of the supervised Washington County. Now, 2 years go by, and in May 31st, 1848, the Wisconsin Territory in fact becomes the state of Wisconsin, and that same year, the state legislature authorizes each county to choose a permanent county seat by popular vote. 7 communities are in the running for purposes of that election. The top vote getter being Port Washington, followed by Cedarburg. West Bend now is in third place with a grand total of 336 votes. There are also 4 other areas that receive votes. Newark, now called Barton, Newburgh, Saukville, and County Farm. But as was the case with regards to the temporary county seat vote 2 years earlier, no site receives 50% of the vote. That leads to 2 additional elections over the course of the next 4 months, each time with a narrower field and each time with no clear winner. The result of that is that each election gets more and more bitter, with accusations of ballot stuffing and other misconduct, primarily, again, on the basis of the western portion of the county versus the eastern portion of the county. The 3 principal players in contention for the county seat at that time were West Bend, Port Washington, and Cedarburg. But in the third of those elections to attempt to pick a permanent county seat, the legislature limits the third election in January of 1849 to West Bend and Cedarburg. But when the votes are tallied, there are enough write-in votes for neither that neither West Bend nor Cedarburg received 50% of the vote, and you can guess where those neither votes came from. That election again leads to additional finger-pointing and accusations, but beyond that, there is just a lot of general frustration as the county has no permanent seat, it has no courthouse, it has no permanent place to hold meetings, it has no permanent place to house their records. The legislature in Madison is continuously under siege by interests on both sides, demanding that something be done. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has petitioned to order that a courthouse be built somewhere in the supersized Washington County, which they declined to do, and the situation is bad and getting worse. Eventually, a proposal was floated to divide the county east to west, creating two different counties, one in the north and one in the south. The problem with that proposal is that in the northern portion of the supersized Washington County, primarily in the east, the Irish and Luxembourg Catholics are in the majority and the Lutherans are in the minority, while in the southern portion of the county, it's the reverse, with the Lutherans in the majority and the Irish Catholics in the minority. Those opposed to the north-south split of the county, primarily Port Washington, which thought it would lose out as the county seat in that proposal, sends writers in both directions to fan the flames by telling the minority Lutherans in the north that if this proposal is passed, they'll be ruled by the Pope, and telling the minority Irish Catholics in the south that if this proposal is passed, their Irish children are going to have to learn to speak German. Nonetheless, the legislature in 1850 does officially propose a north-south county system in the supersized Washington County. The northern county to retain the name Washington County, the southern county to be called Tuscola County. And when that comes up for a vote in the spring of 1851, it goes down in flames by a 5-to-1 margin. Hartford, again, refusing to take part in the election, refusing to be subject to either the northern or southern county. The legislature takes one more shot at attempting to resolve the issue by proposing that a temporary county seat be established in Grafton, with the county seat being moved to West Bend a few years thereafter. That plan goes nowhere as well, among similar allegations of voter fraud. This one, however, having some teeth, as the town of Belgium cast 763 votes when the total number of voters in the town of Belgium does not exceed 300. Finally, some common sense prevails, and an alliance is formed between the lobbying interests for West Bend in Madison with the lobbying interests of Port Washington in Madison, and those lobbying interests come to the legislature and propose a split from the north to the south of Washington County, with the western portion of the Washington County retaining the name Washington County, with the county seat being West Bend, and the eastern portion of the supersized Washington County being called Ozaukee County, with the county seat being located at Port Washington. And the state legislature is obviously more than happy to put an end to that dispute, which has been going on for years, and they immediately jump on that suggestion and rush through legislation before opposition can form. And on March 4th, 1853, the legislature passes Chapter 21 of the laws of 1853, which divides the supersized Washington County along the lines we are now familiar with the western portion of the state being called, western portion of the county being called Washington County, and the eastern portion being called Ozaukee County, with West Bend and Port Washington being the respective county seats. As an aside, it looks to me like that original legislation that laid out the legal description dividing Ozaukee County and Washington County makes reference to the eastern line of the county running due east, not to the shore of Lake Michigan, but to the shore of Lake Winnebago. Now, I'm sure that was a typographical error, but part of me likes to think that those people in Madison knew there was a big lake over here somewhere, they just didn't know what it was called. Additionally, the reason for the 90-degree turn in the description that now divides Washington and Ozaukee County is that the legislature followed the range line that runs through Washington County, and according to Brian Braithwaite, given the curvature of the earth, those range lines need to be adjusted now and then to keep a due north-south relationship, and that adjustment of that range line just happened to occur in the supersized Washington County. Now, you would think that after all these years of bickering and infighting, the issue would finally be resolved, but it wasn't. There were two issues that still need to be addressed. One had to do with official county records. Although we now have two separate counties, we have one set of official county records. And although the legislation creating Ozaukee County gave Ozaukee County the right to copy those records, those original records were in the hands of the people of Port Washington, and they were not about to give them up. This leads to at least 2 midnight raids by West Benders into Port Washington in an attempt to seize those records. The first attempt resulted in nothing, as the Port Washington people are tipped off that the West Benders are coming and are able to hide the records. The second attempt was more successful, as someone sympathetic to the Washington County cause informs the raiders of where the records are, and they are able to seize those records and bring them back to West Bend. Although I am told, and Ashley may be able to confirm this, that there were 2 volumes of official county records that were never recovered. The other issue, however, dealt with a direct challenge to the authority of the legislature to divide Washington County in the first place. Article 13, Section 7 of the Wisconsin's Constitution, then, as it does now, prohibits the legislature from dividing a county that has less than 900 square miles. And even the supersized Washington County appeared to have less than 900 square miles. That dispute eventually goes to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and in the summer of 1853, the Wisconsin Supreme Court decides the case of the state of Wisconsin, ex rel. Simeon D. Powers versus Charles H. Larrabee, Charles H. Larrabee being the circuit court judge for the area. And on page 200 of volume 1 of the official court reports of the state of Wisconsin, the very first volume of court reports, and by the way, there are now over 650 volumes of these court reports, the Wisconsin Supreme Court issues its decision and says to the plaintiffs, you're correct. The supersized Washington County had less than 900 square miles, if you look only at the dry land. But if you look at the shore of the supersized Washington County along Lake Michigan, and you take those sections of land that are located there and you extend them into Lake Michigan, then the supersized Washington County has more than 900 square miles. And we believe that's the way it should be described. And therefore, they dismissed the challenge to the division of Washington County. The 2-county system is approved, and that is why even today the boundaries of Ozaukee County extend into Lake Michigan. At long last, the issue of Washington County is resolved. I think Carl Quickert, the leading historian of Washington County, put it best when he said it was a fight which exhaustion alone could end. We now have a smaller Washington County, but we have resolved the issue of where the county seat should be located. Luckily, we don't have to fight about where the courthouse should be located in West Bend, because those 3 gentlemen that I mentioned earlier, Byron Kilbourne, James Nealon, and E.B. Walcott, who were primarily responsible for laying out the plat of the village of West Bend, dedicate a portion of that village, a square piece of land located at one of the highest points of the village, for purposes of a public park or a public building. That square of land is located in the original plat of West Bend on what they call 5th Street and Park Street, what we today call 5th Avenue and Poplar Street. And it is there that the original courthouse is built in 1854, a wood frame structure followed a couple of years later by a brick and stone fireproof building for purposes of housing public records. And as we all know, in 1889, those buildings are removed. The frame building, by the way, being taken to downtown West Bend at the corner of Main and Hickory, where it serves as a hardware store for many, many years, and replaced in 1889 by the beautiful Romanesque revival-style courthouse that still exists today. As we all know, that courthouse served Washington County well until 1962, when the new courthouse, as it is called, was built, followed by the Justice Center that I'm sitting in today in 2006. So, it has been nearly 182 years after a portion of Milwaukee County is carved out and the new Washington County created. I am sure that the settlers involved in the early struggles of Washington County would be both amazed and proud of how this county has developed in that time. I want to thank all of you as the elected representatives of the county in continuing to carry out that proud history of Washington County. Good luck with the rest of your session today, and it has been a privilege to talk to you.